Thanks everybody for joining us here today. I'm going to talk about parallel computing concepts, and this is from the new complex project that started this year at SDSC. Um, so let me just get my setup here. Okay. Yeah, so if you're not familiar with the complex training program here at SDSC, it's a new cyber training project funded by the National Science Foundation. And the aim of the project is to teach different topics in high performance computing that allows end users of many of the resources funded by the National Science Foundation that use high performance computing in their research, but may not be particularly focused on, say, developing your own software for these advanced cyber infrastructure resources like we have at SDSC, such as Expanse, if you're familiar with that supercomputer we have here. Some of the topics in the complex training program include things like we'll talk about today, parallel computing concepts, some of the standard like Linux command line tools and bash scripting that you need to learn how to use, some topics on security and how to interact with these types of resources in secure ways and secure your data there. We also have topics on batch and high throughput computing, how to get help from the help desk, such as people like me and Nicole who support the help desk for Expanse, and other topics like data management and interactive computing. So if this is your first time joining the complex training program, this is essentially the first lecture that we started off with earlier this year, and it's usually given by Bob Singovitz, who is the PI on the complex project, but he was on vacation day, so I'll be walking you through some of the material. So this is the agenda for today. We have about an hour for the lecture, and then we always have a 30-minute block after the lecture for questions and answers. So if there's any questions that come up along the way, we'll try to answer them in the chat as we go. Or if I notice them in the chat, I'll try to answer them as well. But at the end, if you have time to stick around and want to ask some more in-depth questions and have some back and forth, we'll do that then. So yeah, today's topic is parallel computing concepts, and the goal of this session is to teach you some of the terminology and definitions around parallel applications as run on high performance computing systems, supercomputers like Expanse. So if you're very familiar with things like MPI and OpenMP, processes and threads, this might be pretty introductory material for you. But that's the goal for today's talk, to teach people about processes, threads, what MPI is, what OpenMP is, how these are incorporated into the types of applications you may run on systems like Expanse and SDSC or other supercomputing centers around the country as part of your research. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so parallel computing concept. So, the reason that you might start using high performance computing resources for your research is that your local computing resources, such as on your laptop or desktop systems you might have in the lab, are sort of running out of the computing power for the types of problems that you need to solve. And so when you first start out in using high performance computing, that's usually the transition that it's usually the motivation for transitioning to high performance computing systems. So that you need to now run whatever applications that you're using as part of your research on a more computationally powerful system with more cores, more memory. Maybe you need advanced GPUs for the types of problems you're solving, and you don't necessarily have access to those on your personal computer or in a sort of lab workstation. And so, this session is really intended not only for you as, maybe graduate students, postdocs, faculty and staff, for making this transition to high performance computing, but, there's also many people who sort of have to sort of help manage computing resources for labs and understanding the different concepts to sort of apply for compute time on campus clusters or on the NSF for nationally funded systems. Yeah, or you might be considering even purchasing hardware for your lab and need to understand some of these concepts, to understand, the type of compute resource that you might want to purchase for your lab to support the applications that you run there. Okay. Yeah, so motivation, I think I've already sort of mentioned this, is, this is really background material to understanding the different components that are most popular in parallel applications that you might run on an HPC system today. And this is things like MPI, OpenMP, and CUDA, and other types of technologies we'll talk about here briefly in this session. In general, this is again targeted at people who are not writing their own code, but are generally using applications written by others that have been parallelized to run on these types of systems. And so this is, the level of material that you'll see here. Now this is there's 3 myths that Bob has here in his talk that I like quite a bit. And this is pretty common when people first get started in parallel computing. And in the past, many traditional parallel applications that you would run on high performance computing systems would be in sort of the traditional hard sciences. But today, there's tons of applications in biology and life sciences and other fields outside of the traditional hard sciences that would usually utilize these supercomputing resources for their work. But it's really across all fields too. I mean, you can just look at the explosion in sort of AI applications. I'm sure everyone in their field has some sort of AI application today that's that they've seen. And this is one type of computational problem that can take advantage of these advanced computing resources like GPUs or multiple GPUs across multiple nodes to train these models, right? Myth number 2 is probably the most important one, in the sense that many people think that just by having access to a supercomputer, that if you run it there, your code will run faster. That's not always the case, right? So just having access to more hardware or more advanced computing hardware does not necessarily mean that your application will run faster, right? These applications have to be written to take advantage of the parallel hardware that you have access to. And so there's if you don't know if your application that you're running, say on your local laptop or desktop, has been parallelized, it might not necessarily be advantageous to take it to HPC resources if it's not parallelized. Of course, there's other caveats here, as Bob notes, is that if you do have an application that's not necessarily parallelized, maybe it's a serial code, but maybe you need to run, hundreds of thousands of iterations of some sort of parameter sweep across your simulation, or thousands of files that need to get analyzed with this serial code. Having access to a high performance computing resource that can then run that serial applications thousands, hundreds of thousands of times might be what you're actually looking for. So it's not always about parallel applications and sort of scalability of the code. There are other applications where you might have sort of one of these high throughput computing workloads where you just have to analyze tons and tons of data with a very simple application over and over and over again. So, but yeah, I think number 2 is the most important. And myth number 3, yeah, you don't need to be a programmer or software developer to make use of parallel computing. As sort of, Bob focused this talk around, it's like most users at the end of the day aren't writing their own parallel code. They're, in general, the users on our systems are using applications written by other research groups around the world, or are using some popular commercial software like, TensorFlow and PyTorch today for, sort of the AI applications that you might be interested in. Right, those are able to take advantage and run things in parallel, but most people are not necessarily writing the low-level code that implements that. Right, they're just making use of the software that can take advantage of the hardware. So yeah, so these are some popular codes that Bob's highlighting. So if you're in sort of the atmospheric research sciences, you might do some weather modeling. We have molecular dynamics codes are very popular on our systems. Probably takes up quite a significant amount of the computational workloads that we run. There's also, we have phylogenetic codes and many, again, a lot of material science applications as well, in addition to the molecular dynamics you see. So when you do get started in high performance computing and using some of these advanced resources, right, it's a little intimidating if you don't know how these systems are sort of constructed, right? There's a lot of different pieces that go into making up these systems and how they're designed. So this is kind of a pretty detailed overview of the different parts that go into Expanse, our sort of main production NSF-funded supercomputer here at SDSC. But the general architecture of most high-performance computing resources that you might use is very similar, in the sense where the sort of the largest contained unit that you would then sort of connect together is what's known as a rack, right? So this is what's labeled here as this scalable compute unit, right? So you sort of have this, sort of refrigerator tall sized rack that you then slot in different compute nodes into, right? So this, each rack on Expanse has 56 CPU nodes, right? And so each of these compute nodes is a standalone sort of workstation-like computer, right? However, on most HPC resources, each compute node typically has 2 sockets or 2 processors of CPU cores in the node, in addition to sort of the memory that supports each of those nodes. So, unlike your laptop or maybe a workstation you have at, in your lab, there are actually 2 physical CPU sockets with multiple cores, CPU cores per processor socket there in the node. So that's one sort of architectural difference that you'll sort of quickly run into on any HPC system, usually these dual socket nodes. And then you might have more advanced sort of accelerator hardware like GPUs in the node. So in addition to having 56 CPU nodes per rack in Expanse, we also have 4 nodes in each rack that also have 4 GPUs per node. So those GPU nodes have, again, 2 CPU processors each, and then 4 GPUs sort of backing them for sort of the GPU accelerated applications that you might run, such as PyTorch, for example. And then each of these racks usually have sort of a network switch that are then sort of networked together into a more complete system with multiple racks, and that's what makes up your supercomputer. Then, of course, there's a sort of other systems like the storage systems that are attached to this to the supercomputer as well, where you'll write out the data or read in the data from these sort of advanced sort of file systems you might have access to. And so every system is a little different, but each of these components you'll find somewhere, usually on most systems these days, right? Yeah, so processes, threads, MPI, and OpenMP. So sort of the most fundamental definitions when you start talking about parallel applications, or really trying to understand what's happening when you run an application on one of these systems, or even your system at home, is, the difference between processes and threads. Okay, so a process is an instance of a program. So every time you run an application, there's always going to be a process that started. And this is a an independent sort of element that's managed by the operating system that you're running on. And it's each process is isolated in the sense it has its own sort of memory and compute resources that are assigned by the operating system for the process when it's running your application, right? A thread is a sort of a subunit of a process, right? So it's a lighter weight sort of element. It's sort of the smallest element of executable within any application, executable sort of code that you might run in your application. So every process has at least one thread, but every process could have multiple threads within a process as well. However, the difference between processes and thread that's probably the most important, and we'll see here with the definitions of MPI, or the discussion of MPI and OpenMP, is that processes, right, have their own memory, right? Whereas threads actually share memory within a process, right? So if you have multiple threads, and each thread might be running on different CPU cores, right, can still access the same memory from within that process that they're sort of shared within, right? And so this leads into what's known as sort of the distributed versus shared memory model, which we'll talk about here shortly. So yeah, just some more points here. So in general, starting up a process incurs more sort of overhead than sort of multi-threading, say, a piece of code that you might run. But as Bob notes here, the processes are more flexible. You can actually run multiple processes within a node across a single node, but you can also have, as I mentioned briefly here, you can have, every node, if you're running a parallel application, the way that you actually run an application across multiple nodes requires you running multiple processes across the nodes and doing inter-process communication across those nodes. So that's what we're going to talk about with MPI here in this sort of distributed memory model. Whereas threads are sort of tied to this shared memory model where, every thread will live within a process. Every process will be run on a single node. And so if you have a multi-threaded application, and you're sort of limited to a single compute node in anything that you do, if it's sort of only a threaded application, right? Or you don't have this multi-process application. Yeah. So yeah, why do you care? And I think we've kind of mentioned this, but at the end of the day, this will determine the type of memory model that you're using when you're running your application, right? So understanding whether your application implements a distributed memory model where you can actually run the application across, say, multiple nodes, multiple processes across these nodes, or it's a shared memory or threaded application only where you're sort of limited to a single node, right? And this is very important to that myth number 2, right? Whereas if you have a shared memory sort of threaded application that you want to run, asking, the scheduler that runs, these HPC systems for 2 nodes doesn't make any sense, right? Just asking the scheduler to provide you 2 compute nodes when your application can only use a single node is sort of a mistake, right? I mean, and you're going to waste your precious computing time on these systems if you don't understand how to, request the amount of resources that you need to match the type of application you're trying to run, right? And whether it's even feasible for it to run across multiple nodes, right? So that's kind of the idea here, that you really want to understand what type of application do you have. Today, many of these applications that you might run into, though, are also known as sort of what we would call hybrid applications, where they implement both a distributed memory and shared memory model combined. So you sort of have both a multi-process application with multiple threads within each of those processes. So you sort of have this hybridization of the application that allows you to sort of mix and match the number of processes and threads while also running it across multiple nodes and multiple cores, right? And so this is sort of the 3 types of general classes of applications that you might see. It might be your application might be only a distributed memory application where you're only starting multiple processes. You might have a shared memory application where you have a single process that starts, but it sort of is multi-threaded and will spin up many threads that you can run across many compute cores on a single node. Or you might have a hybrid, but somewhere between the two, where you have the flexibility of starting, some number of processes and some number of threads within those processes across multiple nodes. When it comes to sort of the canonical example of a distributed memory model programming framework, sort of is the message passing interface. So most applications that implement a distributed memory model for their parallelization use MPI. And so MPI is a framework essentially for parallelizing C, C++, and Fortran applications. And so it's been around since I think about the late 90s. And so it's pretty well established, and that's why you'll find it in many different applications that have been developed for a long time. There is, I guess there's not, I guess he's talking about standards. I guess there's no official standard, but there are sort of, you'll find sort of there is sort of an MPI reference implementation sort of standard out there. I think that most implementations sort of adhere to, or in their development paths. But MPI itself is sort of, this framework of how to write these multi-process applications. But each implementation, right, there are multiple sort of MPI distributions out there that you can use, right? So these are libraries that you would compile your application against, or that the application that you're using might be compiled against. And the big ones are usually, OpenMPI and MVAPICH are probably the most common ones I think you'll see on most systems. That's sort of the 2 main ones that we support. I think we also have Intel MPI on some of our in some of our software stack as well. But those are the 2 big open source ones that you'll see mentioned quite a bit. So these are, projects that are implementing an MPI library essentially, right? So each one has its own sort of unique features and sort of, characteristics in terms of performance and sort of how they implement the sort of MPI standard essentially in some way. But there's not necessarily like a good reason necessarily to choose one or the other, and except maybe for whatever reason your application or the the algorithms implemented in your application can take advantage of different feature sets in different distributions. It's kind of in the weeds though. But yeah, so this is, I think the last point here is important in the sense that, MPI is not the only sort of distributed memory parallelization framework that you'll find. There are other ones out there. I know we have some applications that use Charm++, but again, MPI will be the most popular one that you'll find out there. So if you have an application that has MPI, this is what this is. If you are using sort of any sort of deep learning like TensorFlow or PyTorch, if you've encountered something called Horovod, this is actually based on using MPI as their method for doing sort of distributed training. So if you are using TensorFlow or PyTorch and doing distributed training and using Horovod, that's using MPI as its sort of communication layer, essentially. There are other libraries that implement their own communication framework, like NVIDIA has their own collective communication library that backs some of these applications as well that you might be using. So, which isn't MPI, so I'm not exactly sure why it's in this slide, but it's there are other sort of distributed Nickel here, NCCL is another sort of distributed communication framework for doing distributed multi-process applications, but it's obviously designed primarily for these collective communications that are useful in these sort of deep learning applications. So just to give you a quick flavor for what an MPI application looks like, this is sort of a traditional hello world C program here on the left, right? So it's just sort of, starting the main function or initializing the main function and printing hello world. So for MPI, it's more of like a library driven framework. So you actually have to, there's other functions and things that you call to initialize the MPI program and sort of do this explicit communication, right? Where essentially MPI is really very explicit in the sense like you have to pass data back and forth between all the processes, essentially is how it works. But, it kind of shows you an initial setup here where you actually have sort of these other functions like MPI init, MPI comsize, MPI rank, and so, other functions that are in the library that you use to implement the parallel application. So one of the things that might be useful just to mention here is the term rank. So that usually refers to like every MPI process that starts up in the application is given a rank. So it's basically the ID of the process, right? So if I have an application, say this hello world application, you can run it, say on your laptop. If you have 4 CPU cores, you can run this MPI application, and run it with 4 processes that would start, each rank of an MPI process that starts up in the application would be given an ID, essentially this rank number, right? Which is usually starts, I think, from 0 in most cases. So it would be like, if it was a 4 processor, a 4 CPU core processor you had, and you started 4 processes, the MPI application would have ranks, 0 through 3, essentially. So this one term that you might see if you have an MPI application that would be useful to know about the MPI ranks. So conversely, if MPI is sort of the most popular implementation of a distributed memory sort of programming model, OpenMP is the equivalent on the shared memory side. So OpenMP is sort of this application programming interface for doing shared memory programming. So doing multi-threaded applications in C, C++, and Fortran, right? It's a little different in the sense that it's not like MPI, which MPI, right? Each Implementation is its own sort of library that you compile against. OpenMP is more is built into any compiler that you might use, right? So every compiler has its own implementation of the OpenMP standard within the compiler itself, right? So it's actually a little bit easier to get started with a OpenMP if you were a programmer. That, you know, it's a little bit less overhead to get started. Essentially, it's all based on sort of adding essentially comments to your code that tells the compiler like, hey, I want you to try to parallelize this across multiple threads, essentially, is what the basic strategy is. And that's what the example here will show, right? So you have a simple program here on the left that is just going to initialize some arrays, A and B, and then they're going to add them together into array number C, or array C here. Now, this is the serial implementation. If you take it to the multi-threaded OpenMP version of the program, essentially, right, this pragma here, this comment, is telling the compiler when you compile this code with OpenMP turned on, please sort of, you know, follow this parallelization strategy for this loop, right? And this is kind of where you'll see a lot of OpenMP usage. If you actually look at some source code, right, it's often, you know, the most common thing is probably parallelizing loops, essentially, right, across multiple threads. But yeah, so that's kind of just a flavor of what MPI and OpenMP look like. And this is sort of the big picture reminder, right? MPI is this distributed memory framework for multiple processes, right? So managing multiple, it manages multiple processes. So you have multiple MPI processes in any application you might be running. And then there's different implementations of MPI, right? And the most popular ones I would say are usually MVAPIC and OpenMPI these days. And then on the shared memory sort of multi-threaded model, OpenMP is probably the most common thing that you'll see mentioned for most applications. So again, when you're approaching running your application on an HPC system like Expanse, right? You know, understanding, is your code an MPI application? Is it multi-threaded by OpenMP or something else? Or is it a combination of multiple types of these technologies, right? That you might have a hybrid application where you actually need to set the number of MPI processes you want to use and the number of threads you want to use when you run your application, right? That's kind of the important thing to remember. Okay. So talking about hybrid applications, as I just mentioned, you might have a combination of MPI and OpenMP or some other set of distributed memory and shared memory programming models that was used to write the application that you want to run. And so you need to figure out a strategy for understanding how to distribute the work between the distributed memory side and the shared memory side, usually when you run these applications. And so Bob has here a pretty nice sort of visual representation of kind of what this looks like. And the example here sort of assumes you have, say, 2 compute nodes, right? Here, I would say he sort of has 2 single processor compute nodes, and each processor has 16 CPU cores, right? And that's the blue is the core, the node is the gray, and then there's always a network between them where the communication will happen for sort of the multi-node, multi-process communication across nodes. So for MPI applications, right, if your application is purely MPI, right, and there's no threading, you would start multiple processes on each node, right? And so since you have 16 CPU cores per node here, if you wanted to try to utilize 2 nodes full of 16 CPU cores, you would start up 16 processes per node, right? So the little sort of peach orangish box around the core just means that usually, right, you'll want to bind one process per CPU core, right? If your application was purely MPI based, right, where you have one process per core, as sort of outlined here. If your application was completely threaded, right, and it was only using, say, OpenMP, right, you wouldn't be able to run across multiple nodes, right? You have this shared memory model where you're limited to a single compute node, right? And so in this case, right, as we mentioned, all of the threads are always contained within a process, right? And so if your application is only multi-threaded, right, you'll have a single process running on the node, but you'll have all the threads across all of those CPU cores running on the node, right? So here, this sort of assumes that you have one thread per CPU core, right? So maybe we should probably change these diagrams a little bit to point out the thread. So here you have one process that has a thread distributed on each individual core, right? And that's sort of the visualization here. When you have a hybrid application, right, you have this option of, okay, well, how many processes do I want to start and how many threads per process do I want? Right? In this example, Bob is showing he has two, say, MPI processes per node. They each have, say, 8 threads per process, right? Where each thread is then bound to an individual sort of CPU core, right? So that's sort of the distribution here. But this doesn't, for any given application, how to distribute the processes versus the number of threads will be different depending not only on the application, but on the underlying hardware architecture of the node itself, right? Here you could run, this second example here is showing that you could run a single process per node and all threads across the cores, or any combination somewhere between here where you go from one processes per core to one processes per node with all of the different ways to slice and dice the CPU cores amongst the threads and processes. Which one of these for your application and the actual hardware that you're using is sort of something that you would have to figure out, right? Of which one is the most efficient. For example, like on Expanse, for many of these hybrid applications these days that we run, right, because of how the CPU processors are designed, actually, usually we run, 32 MPI processes with 4 threads per process across, individual cores in any given node. That's sort of the general sweet spot in terms of just because if you actually look at the physical design of the processor itself, it's sort of divided up into these little there's 128 cores per node, 64 cores per processor, but each 64 core processor is sort of divided up into these 8 chiplets. Each chiplet has sort of 2 sectors of local memory, essentially, for 4 cores. And so you end up with this sort of 4 CPU cores assigned per process with a thread on each core is kind of the optimal. But again, it depends again on the actual system that you're running on. So this is one of the considerations when you start running an application. If you figure out it's a hybrid application, you need to figure out, okay, well, how many processes per node and how many threads per process do I want to run on the actual, HPC system that you're running on? It might vary between different systems. So about 10 minutes left. And so we'll probably get to, generally talking about Amdahl's law here and the limits of scalability. And then maybe we can talk about some of these, what a scaling study is in the question and answer if it comes up. But hopefully it'll make, I mean, I'll mention it briefly before we begin here at the top of the hour. So Amdahl's law. So, this is sort of the formal proof that myth 2 is the most important as well. That, just throwing more hardware at a problem is actually, there is a fundamental limit, right? Of what that means, of how fast your code can go. So any code that you might, or any application that you might be running, right, there is a fundamental limit of how parallelizable it is. And this is Amdahl's law, which basically states that the speed up that you'll see by providing more processors, the number n here, or the number, to come back to the language here, n sort of is the number of CPU cores if we're talking about a CPU only system here, that you would assign to the application. There is a limit, right? And so if you imagine n going to infinity, the limit says that the speed up, or how fast the application will scale, essentially, is limited by 1 over 1 minus p, where p is the fraction of code that can be parallelized. So essentially, if your application is trying to solve a problem where there are sort of fundamental limits to how much work can be computed in parallel, right? The code is always limited by the serial fraction, this 1 over s, or by the problem itself, essentially, right? So there's always, usually somewhere in any application, that something has to happen serially, and so you're essentially limited by that fraction of the application's execution that will limit the total speed up that you can see. And this actually looks quite dramatic if you've never seen this before, right? Where regardless of the number of CPU cores, right? So here we go from essentially 1 to 10,000, right? Which is not unreasonable. Like on Expanse, you can run up to, I think, any job can use up to 4,096 cores, I think. But the fact that you can actually request that for your job doesn't mean that the code application that you're running will be able to ever take advantage of all of that compute power, right? And Amdahl's law shows here that the maximum speed up is really limited by how parallelized that application is, right? So even if 90% of all of the function calls and all of the math in the application that's happening underneath the hood, if 90% of that's getting done in parallel, the maximum speed up you'll ever see is 10, right? Which is on a system like Expanse, which has every compute node has 128 cores. If you used a whole compute node and the code that you're using isn't very well parallelized, even at the 90% level, right? You're never going to get, in the ideal case, you would get 128 as your speed up, right? If it was perfectly parallelizable, right? So this is like pretty important to realize, right? If your code or application that you're using isn't that parallelizable, right? You don't necessarily want to throw even a whole compute node at the problem, right? You might want to run on 8 cores all the time, right? Just because of the nature of the application, how it was designed and architected, and just maybe the problem itself. There is just a lot of serial computation that has to happen with the algorithm that's implemented, right? And so this is probably, in addition to sort of understanding, is my application distributed memory, shared memory, understanding the degree with which you can actually scale and use more processes, more threads, this is going to be very specific to the application that you're running, right? And so for, as sort of mentioned in the table of contents, this is where you would want to do a scaling study, right? If you're taking this application from, say, your laptop to now putting on a system like Expanse with 128 cores per node, right? You might want to run that application for a given problem that you've run before on, say, your laptop, and then see how it scales as you increase the number of cores, whether that's in the number of processes or the number of threads, and see what type of speed up you're getting, right? Because that's really the only way to measure, um, easily measure what this parallel fraction is, right? So if you see pretty good scaling, even at the 99% level, right, you'll see more of a trajectory like this. If you're getting something, more down here, you're probably never going to reach, you're probably never going to want to run on a full compute node on a system like Expanse, right? You'll always want to run in sort of what we have on Expanse, or what we call shared partitions, where there's multiple applications running on a given node, because most people actually on a system like Expanse don't use a full node, right? Most of the jobs that we run on our system are actually less than a full compute node, right? Even though each of those jobs might be running, at least some degree in parallel. Maybe it's 4 cores, maybe it's 8 cores, maybe it's 16 cores. It's not easy necessarily for every given code to scale to, very high parallelizability, right? Because it's just either the problem itself or just the implementation of whatever algorithms are being used weren't maybe the best way to do it. This is going to be a fundamental limit that you'll see. Okay. Yeah, so just as we end here at the top of the hour, I mean, this theoretical limit on speed up is really, just one issue in the sense, right? There's different factors that can contribute to the scalability of the problem, right? So it's not just this fundamental limit on the parallel fraction of the code. There's actually like implementation issues in terms of like, some of this serialization can usually be communication overhead, right? You might be waiting for computations to finish before you communicate across processes. Bob also mentions uneven load balancing, right? If you're trying to solve many different parts of a problem in sort of this non-homogeneous way, you might be assigning different compute workloads across multiple processes that aren't even in some sense. And so if the problem isn't well load balanced, you'll have some processes or threads waiting around for other processes and threads to finish before you can kind of synchronize everything and carry on with the calculation or the analysis of the data in the application itself. And so he has some diagrams here with Hello Kitty that sort of illustrate some of these issues, and I think this is the first one in terms of problem size, where, even if you were to start assigning more and more processes to the same problem, it's not necessarily just that, even if the code is well parallelized and you have, large compute nodes like on Expanse with like 128 cores per node, even then, right, if your problem size is too small, right, you might be doing far fewer computations than the overhead from all the communication between the processes and threads to take advantage of the hardware that you have. And so you might see problems just if your problem size is too small. That's one reason why it might not be scaling well as either, right? Even if the code is written well and could scale, it's possible that the problem that you've provided on the input is just too small itself, right? So that's one other sort of limitation, right? So you also have to be able to match the problem size to the resources that you have available. And so I think I'm going to end there, and because we're at the top of the hour. And so for those who can't stick around, please do come back to the slides. There are a few other sort of nice diagrams that sort of outline some of these things on scalability, but I would also look, I think Bob has an example on the scaling studies of like how to graph the results of your scaling studies. So if you want to sort of produce your own sort of Amdahl's law sort of scaling plots, right? This is looking at sort of this parallel efficiency of taking speed up data and turning it into this sort of efficiency graphs. And I think he has a link somewhere here for an example problem, essentially, if you need to sort of apply for computing time, including one of these graphs for like the types of problems that you might run on any HPC system is pretty important, right? Like this is what, if you're going through like a review process and people will review your application for computing time, they're probably going to want to see something like this that would say that, hey, you actually understand your application, you know how to run it, and you know the appropriate amount of resources to assign to the type of problems that you have, right? And where the code will actually be efficient, right? Whereas in this case, right, maybe, the most efficient, here is going to be, 8 cores roughly instead of at 128 cores, right? So this is definitely a useful part of the presentation here as well to check out. Okay, so we'll go ahead and stop there and open up for questions for anyone else who wants to stick around.